Good morning. This is Pleasant Valley Baptist Church, Two Rivers, Alaska. Wayne Shea, the pastor. We're glad to have you with us. We're on Facebook and on YouTube, so we hope that this will be a blessing to you. We are going through the book of Acts. In theological circles, we call this an exegetical study. In other words, just going line by line, word by word, and trying to determine what the Lord would have for us. 24th chapter is dynamite. It's just loaded. And I've got to get busy, Mark, or I'm not going to get through either. We read in verse 1, "And after 5 days, Ananias the high priest descended with the elders." Well, I need to go back to verse 33 to get our context. 32, "On the morrow they left the horsemen to go with him and return to the castle, who, when they came to Caesarea," now this is Paul and 70 horsemen and a centurion, and they're going from Jerusalem to Caesarea nonstop. "And who, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. And when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was. And when he understood that he was of Cilicia, 'I will hear thee,' said he, 'when thine accusers are also come.' And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall." So he's confined yet, but he's not in the dungeon. He's not in the terrible, terrible prison. And it says, "And after 5 days," verse chapter 24, "Ananias, the high priest, descended with the elders." They use the word descended because, remember, Jerusalem's 2,700 feet above sea level. Caesarea is on the Mediterranean Sea. So if you go to Jerusalem, you go up. If you're in Jericho and you go to Jerusalem, you go up. If you go from Jerusalem to Caesarea, you go down. If you go to Jericho, you go down. So that's why they use the word descended. "Descended with the elders," that'd be the Sanhedrin, "and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul." Now, Tertullus is probably a Gentile. He's called an orator here. This is the only place you'll find this word in the Greek in the New Testament. It actually means not just an orator, but a lawyer. So the Jews have hired a lawyer to take their case against Paul because they haven't been having good luck at all. And verse 2, "And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, Paul, saying, 'Seeing that by thee we enjoy,'" to the king, what's his name? Felix. "And when he was come forth, Tertullus began to accuse Paul, saying, 'Seeing that by thee, Felix, we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy province, we accept it always, in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness.'" Now, in my book, they call this introduction flattery. Now, what he was trying to do was he was trying to bend the thinking of Felix. Now, Felix was a rat. He had been born a slave. His family that had bought him liked him, and the wife had really promoted him. He became very, very, well, he fell into the lap of luxury. He was bought from his slavery, and he was a rat. One of the historians, a Roman historian, not a Jewish, but a Roman, talking about this king, Felix. If he exercised royal power with the mind of a slave. That's a quote, a translation. He exercised the power that he had with the mind of a slave. We have this lawyer using flattery on him, and he says here, great quietness. It's going to be 2 years, and Roman's going to recall him and take his position away from him. And in a few years, this man's going to be so distraught, he's going to take his own life. He did anything but quiet Israel down. Very worthy deeds. He was a rat. You're going to find this out. He's going to try to get Paul to pay money to release him. He tries to want Paul to buy him off. And they just went on and went on and went on. Now he gets down to verse 4 and he gets into the case. Notwithstanding that I be not further tedious to thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency, your kindness. He wasn't kind. He was a rat. He was terrible. Felix was not good. Verse 5. Here's the charges. For we have found this man a pestilent fellow. He was a pest. My mother's called me that sometimes. Can I have an ice cream cone, Mama? Can I go? Can I do that, Mama? They called him a pest. And we'll be talking about this. He's a troublemaker, a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world. Do you notice how this guy exaggerates everything? And a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also has gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. Now, this guy is using every trick in the book. He is a lawyer. I had a friend that their dad was a lawyer, and I asked her, I said, what do you feel about your dad being a lawyer? Well, she's a lawyer too. She says, it was hard for me to understand how my dad would go and try to defend somebody that he knew in his heart was guilty. And she said, it was really hard for me to reconcile that. But as you look at the situation here, it's just going, this lawyer, uses superlatives, he exaggerates, he uses flattery, he uses falsehood, he misrepresents things. Remember, he's a paid advocate. He's paid to lie. That's why this Tertullus was a lawyer. I want you to know he's not going to get to first base. He's not going to do any better than the Jews had done in Jerusalem. The accusations, let's look at them. He said he's a pest. He's just a guy that irritates everybody. Now, he didn't irritate everybody. Some people really liked Paul, didn't they? And they're like Luke and Silas and some of these Bartimaeus. But it says here, he's a pest. Next of all, he's a mover of sedition. He is a worldwide troublemaker. You see, the folks that had been Asians that were in Jerusalem for the feast, they said, well, he's doing the same thing up in Ephesus. But I want you to notice none of those people showed up for the trial up here in Caesarea. They're all gone. So that charge kind of just dies of a natural death. And then he starts about he's always trying to start a riot somewhere. Well, did Paul start riots? One of my favorite old-time preachers, Vance Havner, said wherever Paul went, he brought a riot or a revival. They either, like Lystra and Iconium, they either stoned him, left him for dead, run him out of town, and Paul was a very decisive character, but he was preaching the truth. Next of all, it says here, a mover of sedition among the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene. Now, he's using the word Nazarene in a bad light, and he's saying this guy is a Nazarene, and they don't have a word for Christian yet, so they call it the Way or the Nazarene, and they say he's a ringleader to that. And then he goes on to say in verse 6, who also had gone about to profane the temple. Now, this is really interesting to me. He's saying Paul was going about to profane the temple. What had the Jews said back in chapter 21? Do you remember?
He'd already done it.
They said he had done it. Let's see if I can find that reference. It's chapter 21 and verse 28. Crying out, men of Israel, help. This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple and hath polluted this holy place. They said he actually did it here, but when we get to Caesarea, they said he tried to. Do you see a change? You see, nobody would stand up and say, we saw him take Trophimus into the holy place. Nobody would make that, nobody would come right out and lie about that. They said, well, we saw him with Trophimus and we figured he had been in the holy place with him. Well, he had been in the holy place, but you know what he was doing? He was in there worshiping the Lord. So over here, they've changed their charges. They've lessened them. Now, as you go through here, what this lawyer is trying to do, he's trying to put a political spin on what Paul's doing. Have you ever heard of spin, political? We hear it all the time, don't we? Number one, he said back here that this guy was stirring up the Jews. The Romans wanted one thing, and that was peace. They didn't want to have all this rabble-rousing going on. So this lawyer's appealing to Felix and saying, this guy is going against exactly what you wanted. Number two, the Romans would not allow any new religion to start. Where was Paul when they arrested him? He was in the temple, right? Well, you see, Paul was a Jew, and he wasn't. Christianity is an outgrowth of Judaism because Jesus was a Jew, right? And because he was a Jew and he died on the cross and was buried, the Jews still went to the temple to worship. But they still believe that Jesus Christ died for their sins, whereas the other Jews said he's not the Messiah. So you see, it's a schism within Judaism, but it's not a new sect. And this guy was trying to influence Felix to believe that this was a new sect, and therefore Paul was illegal. And now he says Paul tried to desecrate the temple. Was Paul in the temple to desecrate it? He was in there worshiping with 4 of his friends. He was in there paying for their sacrifice. He was in there worshiping and so forth. And so he's done all of this. Now in verse 7, this lawyer's going to try to put some blame on the chief captain, Claudius Lysias, verse 7. But the chief captain, Lysidius, came upon us and with great violence took him away out of our ranks. Now, just a minute. Where was the great violence? The great violence was the Jews. It wasn't Paul. It wasn't Paul causing the violence. Paul was in the temple worshiping. Now, what he's trying to do is shift the responsibility from the Jews now to the Roman captain who came down and with great, violence, takes Paul away from him. He was saying, in essence, if you'd have left him in our hands, we'd have finished him off, and you wouldn't be worried about him today. And they would have. Number 8, commanding his accusers to come unto thee. In other words, the Jews were still stinging because Claudius took that 470 some men and got Paul out of Jerusalem before they killed him. And this is still stinging. And it says, by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to change the emphasis and the direction. Verse 9, and the Jews also assented, saying that these things were so. So the Jews are agreeing and saying, yeah, what he's saying is right. Yes. It's trying to get somebody else to fight their fight. Now, remember, had not the chief captain sent a letter to Felix? And did not that letter say, I don't think this guy's worthy of death? And here's this lawyer saying, well, the chief captain, your own Roman, he's a rat too. So you see, lawyers haven't changed a lot. If they're not honest, they're not honest. They're still tilted. Now, you can imagine Paul has had to sit there and listen to this and hear all these accusations against him, and he hasn't said a word. You talk about self-control. If you've ever been to court, I've seen defendants jump up and say, that isn't so, Notice what we read in verse 10. Then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him to speak. In other words, Felix said, okay, Paul, what's your view on this? He answered, forasmuch as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation. That is not flattery. He said, Felix, I know you've been a judge. I think at this period of time, it was 6 or 8 years, he had had his judgeship here in Jerusalem, in Caesarea. He said, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. He said, I'm going to answer for myself for what I've done. Paul didn't hire a lawyer. Verse 11, because that thou mayest understand that there were yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. Notice, he said, I cannot be a ringleader and stirring all this strife up in just 7 days. Remember, this has been 4 days since the Jews have come up and they did all the transportation and everything. He only had 7 days, or actually 6 days in Jerusalem to cause all this trouble. And he said, and I was in Jerusalem, and I wasn't there to rabble-rouse. I was in the temple. I was praying, I was meditating, and I was studying. So Paul is starting out with his introduction. He's much more truthful. he said, Felix, you know the truth. I like that. He doesn't try to influence the judge. He said, the time was too short for me to cause a riot. My purpose was to worship, to observe the Feast of Pentecost. And I want you to notice something else. In verse number, 17. We'll come to this. Now, after many years, I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings. He said, I was bringing money to the people of Jerusalem. And you're saying I was here to cause a riot? He said, this isn't the case. This is interesting that this is one of the very few times that Paul overtly talks to the Jews about this money. In verse 12, and they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues, nor in the city. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. I mean, he hits the nail on the head. He said, they can't prove it. They can make the accusations, but proving it is something else. When I was an inspector for the Spirit of Alaska, the company's lawyer said, anybody with $50 can file a lawsuit. And one day, the lawyer come in and said, there's been $1 million lawsuit filed against the credit union, against the CEO, and against certain people in the credit union personally. Now, that was a very somber day for someone to file $1 million lawsuit against you. But the lawyer said, remember, he has to prove it. And that's what Paul's saying here. They haven't proved a thing. They've made the accusations. I might as well tell the rest of the story. He never followed up with anything. It just went away. Caused a lot of heartache. Now, verse 14. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way, Paul says of all the accusations they made about me, I am guilty of one of them, and that is I am of the Nazarene. I am of the Christ. I am a Christian, which they call heresy. So worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. He says, I believe the Old Testament. I believe the promises that God has made. I believe in Moses. I believe in Abraham and Isaac. I mean, you know something? He's got a real lawyer in himself, doesn't he? I mean, he's coming down to the real facts. And then he says in verse 15, and I have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. Do you understand what he's doing? He's getting real close to preaching. Yes, he's defending himself in a court of law. He's in bonds. But does that stop him from preaching? He says, I believe in the resurrection. Oh, just a minute, before I go any further, what is the gospel?
The death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus.
The death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. Folks, this is his introduction. I want you to see how sly this guy is. And you know, even though he was here protecting his life, he was still preaching, folks. And he says, they allow that. And verse 16, and herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. It's very important that we are not offensive, that we have a clear conscience. You know, there's a lot of things as a pastor I would like to do, but I don't do because it would alienate me from some people. You know what I'm talking about? There are just some things I steer way clear of. If any offense is going to come, I want it to be because of the shed blood of the Lord Jesus Christ. He said, I have a clear conscience. You know, that's saying a bunch. He said, I'm not feeling guilty. And then he goes on and says, verse 17, now after many years, I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings. My nation. He's not ostracizing himself from the Jews. He's saying, I'm come to help my people. You know, we as Christians should have this same thing. We should be of the notion that we're here to help the people. And doing it kindly, not doing it with a purpose in mind other than glorifying God. He says in verse 18, whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me, purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult. He said, some Jews from Ephesus found me in the temple, and they say, this guy is up to no good. He's a pestilent fellow, and he's here to cause a disturbance. Verse 19, who ought to have been here before thee and object if they had aught against me. He said, if they're making these accusations, they should have been here. He said, it wasn't important enough for them to show up. They was just wanting a good argument, and they weren't willing to make a statement in court and stand beside it. Who's winning in this argument? Who's winning this court case? I mean, he's just going down. They made 3 accusations, and he's going down, actually 4, when he said, I am of the way, I am a Christian. He said, I'm guilty of that. The other 3, I'm not guilty of. Verse 20, or else let these same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me while I stood before the council. He said, they should have been here. They should be telling you, sir, of all my terrible bad deeds. 21, except it be for this one voice that I cried, standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day. He said, it's a doctrinal difference. Now, isn't that what Claudius had said? Yep. Now, we're going to get into this in a minute, but Felix really knew the score. He was married to a Jewess. Felix's wife was a Jew. And you can't tell me that Felix didn't know what was going on. Verse 22, and when Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, I ask you, how did Felix know about Christians? That way. See that phrase? He's talking about Christians having more perfect knowledge. I think I think he knew a whole lot more than the Jews thought he knew. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I think we'll be seen very plainly here. He had more perfect knowledge. He said when Lysidius, the chief captain, Claudius, shall come down, I will know the utmost of your matter. So he's going to continue the court case. And then he said, and he commanded a centurion to keep Paul and to let him have what? Liberty. And that he should forbid none of his acquaintances to minister or to come unto him. Can I say he was probably under what we'd call today house arrest? He no longer had to eat his meals with chains on his wrist, chained to a centurion. I would like to think while Paul was with these centurions, and I have a really good respect for the centurions, I think Paul was witnessing to them. The centurion had to sit there and listen to Paul pray. The centurion had to sit there and listen to Paul preach. A captive audience. I don't know who is captive here, Paul or the centurion, but he had to sit there and listen to the preacher. But notice here that he had liberty, and his friends could come and go, and I don't know what happened and what was going on there. Verse 24, and after certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. You know, it says he dismissed the case, or he stopped at making a judgment, give him his liberty, and then he and his wife Drusilla sent for Paul, and they wanted to listen to him, and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now, folks, Felix cannot go away from this the same man. Felix is going to have to make a decision. He may continue the court case, but you're not going to be able to continue his relationship with the Lord. And Paul preached to him. Now, let me tell you something about Drusilla. Drusilla was of a high birth. Her dad was Herod Agrippa II. Her mother was a Jewess. Do you know anything about Herod Agrippa, her dad? Let me see where I wrote that down.
Wasn't he the one who killed John?
Her dad was eaten by worms. Go with me to chapter 12. Herod Agrippa, verse 20, chapter 12. And Herod was highly displeased with them of Tyre and Sidon, but they came with one accord, and having made Blastus the king's chamberlain, their friend, desired peace, because their country was nourished by the king's country. And upon a set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat upon his throne and made an oration unto them. And the people gave a shout, saying, It is the voice of a God and not of a man. And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory, and he was eaten of worms, and gave up the ghost. her dad. Her dad died a terrible death because he resisted the God. And he set himself up as a God. Not only that, she was a very beautiful woman. And you know something? I believe that many times beauty is the destruction of the person. She was depraved in her character. She married a man, left him, married another man, left him. Felix come along, stole her away from her husband, lived in sin. She lived with a seared conscience. She lived for pleasure. She lived to do what she wanted to do and lived to be great and glorious and beautiful and rich. The dream life, right? Remember, she is a Jewess. She knew what the law said. She knew what was right and wrong. But she chose to live a wicked life. Now, Paul's going to preach. What's going to happen? Going back to chapter 24. In verse 25, and as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, there is Paul's outline. He spoke about righteousness, about being right with God. He spoke about temperance. Mark, we talked about it. What did you say temperance was?
Self-control.
Self-control. Was she practicing self-control? Was Felix practicing self-control? Finally, he said, and judgment to come. I want you to understand very plainly, very clearly, that when a person hears the truth of the gospel, you can't go away from it without having made a decision. You either accept it or you reject it. And it's a terrible thing if you reject it. You're accountable to God because he preached here self-control and he preached judgment. And they're sitting here, and guess who's on trial? It's not Paul. Who's feeling guilty? The king and his wife. You know, you may delay, you may resist, but all of that is still plain rejection. You either trust Christ and accept him, or you reject him. Folks, I believe that heaven and hell are real. This week, I spoke with a man who just opened up just out of the clear blue. And he said, my nephew, my brother's boy, contracted cancer. And we tried to talk to him about spiritual things. But he would know. He was more into computers. He was more into the society today. And he said, religion is nothing but hocus pocus. This young man died yesterday. You know what? He knows what hell is all about. You see, when you hear the gospel and you resist it, and you delay it, and you reject it, guess who pays the price? Paul didn't pay the price. They will. Who was on trial? It wasn't Paul. In verse 25, and as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled. He was shaking. He understood the gravity of it. And he answered, go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. How do you know you're going to have another minute? You don't. You know, my Bible says today is the day of salvation. Now is the accepted time. When I was pastoring in southern Colorado, a young lady, I believe she was probably 17, 18, trusted the Lord. She come before the church and told them that she had been saved and wanted to be baptized. The church came around, would shake her hand and everything. When her boyfriend came by, I said, you know, you need to do the same thing. You need to trust Christ as your Savior. Tears came to his eyes. And he said, yes, Pastor, I know. But I got some things I got to clean up before I do that. And I said, no, let him do the cleaning up. Just trust the Lord today. That was Sunday. Wednesday night, he was driving down Highway 50 over 120 miles an hour in a drag race. He was beating the other guy, and the other guy ran him off the road. In an instant, he went through the windshield and lost the top of his head. He didn't have any more time. That morning that I talked to him was his last chance. You know what? People trifle with their souls, and it's going to live forever. Felix was trembling. I don't know what Drusilla was doing. I don't know if she'd come up just for the fun, for the excitement of it and so forth. I don't know. But he said, some more convenient day I'll call on you. Now I want you to notice the route he takes in verse 26. He hoped also that money should have been given to him of Paul. That's called a bribery. That he might loose him. Wherefore he sent for him the oftener and communed with him. His day had come. Paul had preached. He was under conviction. But he said, not now. Not now. Verse 27. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. Paul's going to be left in prison for 2 years because he wouldn't pay the bribe. You know what I ask myself? What did Paul do for those 2 years? Well, let me give you a few suggestions, okay? Number one, he wrote the prison epistles. He wrote Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. Had Paul not been in jail, we wouldn't have those 4 books of the Bible. I believe that he prayed. I believe that he shared with the centurion the gospel way, and I'm sure they rotated them. I believe that he fellowshiped with his friends. I believe he spent time with Luke, sharing with Luke about his conversion, about what he felt, what had happened in his life. Therefore, Luke could write the Gospel of Luke, and he could write the book of Acts. He continued to witness to Felix and Drusilla and Festus. He was a fearless preacher, but he kept preaching. What was Felix and Drusilla doing this 2 years? I think he heard the gospel, but he was lost. I believe he was playing with his soul. You know, you don't know how much time you have. It's going to be very shortly that Felix is going to lose his position, lose his power, and he's going to lose his life. You see, he was indifferent to sin and to its pleasures. Didn't matter to him. The devil had blinded him. He was unconscious that he was so near the precipice. And just like many people today that have not trusted Christ, let me put it just as plain as I know how to say it, headed to hell. You know, friend, this is Felix and Drusilla. But how about you? You must make a decision whether to accept Christ or to reject him. You cannot be indifferent. You'll either spend an eternity with Christ or an eternity with the devil. I don't know why people would take such a chance. I don't know why they would mess around with something so important. But folks, it's appointed unto men once to die. And after that, the judgment. Is the judge going to say, "Depart from me, for I never knew you"? Or is going to say, "Welcome home, well done, good to have you"? See, it's all the difference. All the difference. And folks, it's for eternity. It's not just for a minute. It's not just for a second. It's forever. But you know something? It's your choice. But guess who will pay for it? You will. Mark, do you have a song?